There is a glass plate negative that has been missing since the autumn of 1902, not lost, not misplaced, not destroyed in a fire or damaged in transit, removed. The distinction matters more than it first appears because the record of its removal, a handwritten seizure note filed under a Federal Survey case number that was later reclassified, still exists. What it describes is a photograph taken in the Wyoming interior, developed in a portable field darkroom, and signed on the sleeve by a survey assistant named Thomas Elroy Beckwith. The note says the negative was transferred to a federal repository in Washington. The repository has no record of receiving it. The case number leads to a file that was closed before it was opened. The sleeve, without the plate inside it, is held in a university archive in New Haven, Connecticut, where it has sat in a flat box since 1938, catalogued under the heading Survey Ephemera, No Research Value. No one looked twice at it for 63 years. The official account of North American skeletal anatomy was largely settled by 1895. The bones said one thing, the textbooks repeated it. The Smithsonian's Division of Physical Anthropology had established the parameters of what the continent's pre-Columbian populations had looked like, how they had been built, how tall they had stood, and where the outer limits of that height fell. The number most cited was 6 feet 2 inches as an exceptional ceiling. The record keepers had done their work. The case was, by all institutional consensus, closed. The congressional funding for further skeletal surveys was redirected toward geological prospecting in 1897, a decision made in a subcommittee whose meeting minutes were kept and can still be read in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. The anthropologists who had spent years in the field were reassigned. Their specimen reports were filed. Their photographs were archived. The discipline moved on, and what it moved toward was a tighter, cleaner story, one that fit neatly inside the measurements already established and the funding structures already built to support them. That is the version that entered the schools. There is a freight manifest from a Northern Pacific Railway way station in eastern Montana, dated September the 14th, 1902, that lists among its cargo a sealed wooden crate, approximately 8 feet in length and 400 pounds in weight, consigned to a survey team operating under U.S. Geological Survey contract in the Wyoming Basin. The crate is listed as containing, and here the manifest uses precise language, field instrumentation, no further description. The consignee is listed as a survey team under a contract number. The contract number resolves to a federally commissioned biological specimen survey that was never published. The survey's completion report exists. It was filed in December 1902, but the appendices, which in every other survey of this type would contain the specimen photographs and field measurements, are blank, not missing, blank, pages that were bound into the report and left empty, as if someone knew the measurements would be taken and decided before the survey left that they would not be written down. The blank appendix pages are the crack in the story. Consider what a functioning biological specimen survey requires. It requires photographs. It requires measurements taken in the field, recorded on standardized forms, countersigned by at least 2 team members. It requires specimen documentation, which in 1902 meant photographic plates, heavy, fragile, expensive to produce, impossible to fake once developed. A survey team operating under federal contract in 1902 was not improvising their documentation protocols. They were following a standardized federal methodology that had been in use since 1879. The forms existed. The protocols existed. The photographic equipment, the portable darkroom, the glass plates, the chemical solutions, was expensive enough that it appears on freight manifests and supply requisitions throughout the survey record. The equipment was there, the photographs were taken, the forms were filled, and then, between the field and the filing cabinet, something happened to all of it. What is being claimed here is not that a giant was found. What is being claimed is that something was found, photographed, documented, and then systematically removed from the institutional record in a way that followed a specific pattern,
a pattern visible in at least 4 other Federal Survey records from the same decade, all involving skeletal or biological finds in the Wyoming and Montana interior, all sharing the same feature: completed fieldwork, blank appendices, and a gap in the photographic record that is acknowledged nowhere but visible everywhere. Thomas Elroy Beckwith was 31 years old in 1902. He had worked as a survey assistant for 6 years, primarily under contracts with the U.S. Geological Survey's Western Division. He was not a scientist. He was a logistics man. He managed the equipment, maintained the photographic supplies, and kept the daily field log that every survey team was required to maintain. His daily logs from the Wyoming survey survive. They are held in the same New Haven archive as the empty negative sleeve. The logs cover 61 consecutive days of fieldwork. On day 44, the entry is 9 words long, 9 words for a day that had previously been averaging 3 to 4 paragraphs. 9 words. Specimen located. Photographs taken. Team directed not to speak further. The following day's entry is also brief. Plates sealed. Crate prepared. Instructions received from Washington by telegraph. Then the logs return to their normal length for the remaining 17 days of the survey, covering route conditions, equipment maintenance, and weather. The specimen is not mentioned again. The photographs are not mentioned again. The crate is not mentioned again.
This is not the behavior of a man who documented nothing. This is the behavior of a man who documented exactly what he was permitted to document and understood precisely where the line was.
Beckwith left Federal Survey work in 1903. He moved to a small town in eastern Oregon and spent the rest of his working life as a school teacher. He never published anything. He gave one interview to a regional newspaper in 1931, in which he discussed his survey years in general terms. The interviewer asked whether he had ever encountered anything unusual in the field. Beckwith paused. The interviewer noted the pause in their own handwritten draft, which survives in an Oregon Historical Society collection, and then said, "I encountered things that other people decided were not mine to describe." The published version of the interview does not include this sentence. The interviewer's draft does. Beckwith died in 1944 at the age of 73. His personal papers, if he kept any, have not been located. Now consider the institutional context surrounding the Wyoming survey of 1902. The same year, the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology was operating under a budget allocation that was contingent on its findings remaining consistent with the anthropological consensus already established. This is not a supposition. It is a documented funding condition visible in the Bureau's Congressional Appropriations Record. The specific language, which appears in the 1902 Appropriations Committee report, states that funds were allocated to confirm and extend the existing anthropological baseline, not to revise it. Revision, in this context, was not a scientific possibility. It was a budgetary impossibility, a finding that contradicted the established height parameters, the established skeletal typology, the established population model. Such a finding would not simply require a rewrite of the textbooks. It would require a re-examination of the legal and political frameworks that had been built on top of those textbooks, the land rights decisions, the treaty interpretations. The entire apparatus of federal Indian policy in the late 19th century had been constructed in part on a specific model of who the pre-Columbian populations had been and what their civilizational capacity had looked like. A skeletal find that broke that model was not merely inconvenient scientifically, it was catastrophic institutionally. This is not a conspiracy. It does not require anyone to have met in a room and agreed to suppress anything. It requires only that the people receiving the survey's findings understood, without being told explicitly, that certain findings would end careers and certain findings would be funded again next year. Convergent institutional interest does not need a coordinator. It needs only a funding structure and people who understand how to read it.
The Smithsonian's Division of Physical Anthropology received at least 2 external specimen reports in the 1890s and early 1900s that were never incorporated into its published research. This is documented in the division's own internal correspondence, portions of which were released under a Freedom of Information Act request in 1983. The correspondence does not explain why the reports were excluded. It acknowledges their receipt, it notes that they were reviewed, and then they disappear from the record entirely, not destroyed, not referenced, simply absent from the division's subsequent published work as completely as if they had never arrived. One of the excluded reports, referenced by its filing date in the internal correspondence, was submitted in October 1902, 2 months after the Wyoming Survey's 9-word log entry. The same pattern appears in the records of the Bureau of Land Management's predecessor agency during the same period, in the records of the Army Corps of Engineers Survey Division, and in the acquisition logs of at least 2 natural history museums that were receiving federally sponsored specimens in the 1890s and early 1900s. In each case, the pattern is identical. Field documentation exists, institutional acknowledgement exists, and then the specific specimen or photograph or measurement record is absent from everything that came after. The individual instances are explainable. The pattern is not.
There is a secondary archive at the Smithsonian, not the main research collection, but a holding archive used for materials classified as pending review, that has contained, since at least the 1940s, based on its oldest surviving intake logs, a number of crates whose contents have never been formally catalogued. This is not a secret. The archive's existence is publicly documented. The uncatalogued crates are referenced in a 1976 internal audit as a known backlog of pre-1920 survey materials awaiting resources for proper assessment. Those resources have not been allocated in the nearly 50 years since. The crates have not been opened for public research. Researchers who have requested access to the pending review archive have been told, consistently, that the materials are not yet catalogued and therefore cannot be located for specific requests. The circularity of this administrative position, we cannot catalogue them because we lack resources, and we cannot provide access because they are not catalogued, has remained stable for decades. You cannot request what has not been named. The photograph itself, the one Thomas Elroy Beckwith signed the sleeve for, the one whose negative was transferred to a federal repository that has no record of receiving it, is described in one surviving secondary source, not in the survey record, not in Beckwith's logs, but in a letter written by another survey team member, a geological assistant named Henry Corbin, to his brother in Pennsylvania in the autumn of 1902. The letter was found in a Pennsylvania estate sale in 2009 and donated to a county historical society that posted a transcript on its website. Corbin writes, "We have seen something that has no place in the books we were given." Elroy took the photograph. "I saw the plate before it was sealed. I do not know how to write down what it showed without sounding like a man who has lost his judgment, so I will say only that the proportions were not what we have been taught to expect, and that whoever this person was, they were not small, and they were not recent." Then Corbin writes about something else entirely: the weather, the journey home, the cost of rail tickets. He does not return to the subject. He died in 1918 in France. The letter is the only eyewitness account of what the photograph showed. It is the only external confirmation that a photograph existed at all, and it was sitting in a box in a Pennsylvania County Historical Society for 11 years before anyone connected it to the empty sleeve in New Haven or to the blank appendix pages in the Federal Survey record. Pull back from the Wyoming Survey for a moment and look at the larger architecture. In the 2 decades surrounding 1902, the U.S. federal government was engaged in the most intensive land reclassification project in the nation's history. The Dawes Act of 1887 had broken up communal indigenous landholdings and opened them to individual allotment and eventual sale. By 1902, tens of millions of acres had transferred from tribal holding to federal administration and from federal administration to private sale. The economic interests served by this transfer were not abstract. They were named. They were the railroad companies that needed right-of-way through the western interior. They were the mining concerns that needed access to subsurface mineral rights. They were the ranching operations that needed open grazing land at below-market lease rates from a federal government eager to classify the land as public domain rather than encumbered. A finding that suggested the pre-Columbian history of the Wyoming and Montana interior was more complex, more populated, more civilizationally substantial than the existing model allowed. Such a finding would complicate every land title issued in the previous 15 years. It would not reverse them. The legal mechanisms were too deeply embedded for that, but it would create the kind of public and legal uncertainty that delays permits, elevates scrutiny, and costs the people who needed those permits and that land exactly the kind of money they had spent decades ensuring they would not need to spend. The photograph was not suppressed because someone feared a scientific debate. Scientific debates are cheap. The photograph was suppressed because the thing it showed, if acknowledged, would have put a dollar figure on the official story, and that dollar figure would have been borne by people who had already decided, through the mechanisms available to people with their resources, that they would not be bearing any such cost. You still bear the cost of that decision, not in the obvious way, not in some direct extraction you can point to on a monthly bill. You bear it in the shape of the knowledge you were given, the history that was assembled for you, in the textbooks that defined what was plausible and what was fringe, what was serious scholarship, and what was the province of credulous people who could be safely ignored. That history was not assembled neutrally. It was assembled within a funding structure that rewarded certain findings and defunded others, within an institutional framework that promoted researchers who confirmed the established baseline and quietly ended the careers of those who challenged it. The anthropological consensus of the early 20th century was not wrong because it lacked intelligence or rigor. It was wrong because it was built on a set of finds that had been pre-selected by people who needed it to reach a specific conclusion. You are still living inside the conclusion they needed. The blank appendix pages in the Wyoming survey are not an anomaly. They are the standard operating procedure of a system that understood what knowledge cost and who paid when the wrong knowledge got out. The current architecture of federal land management, the current distribution of subsurface mineral rights in the Western interior, the current legal framework governing what constitutes a historically significant site requiring protection and what constitutes open ground available for extraction. All of it rests on a foundation poured in the same decade as the Wyoming survey, mixed with the same institutional concrete, set according to the same specifications. The people who specified those foundations had names and addresses and specific financial interests that the specifications served. Those interests have compounded across 6 generations. The land is still producing. The revenue is still running. The appendices are still blank. What was proven here is narrow but certain. A biological specimen survey conducted under federal contract in Wyoming in 1902 documented a find significant enough to produce dedicated photography, trigger a federal seizure of the photographic negative, and result in blank appendices in a filed government report. The institutional response to that find followed a pattern visible in at least 4 other federal survey records from the same period. The photographic record was removed from the institutional archive. The eyewitness who saw the photograph before it was sealed described proportions inconsistent with the established anthropological baseline. The man who took the photograph spent the rest of his life as a schoolteacher in Eastern Oregon and said once to one interviewer that he had encountered things other people decided were not his to describe. The loss was not inevitable. It was a choice, made by people with names and institutional addresses and a clear understanding of what the wrong photograph, placed in the wrong hands, would cost the systems they had been retained to protect. There is a flat box in a university archive in New Haven. Inside it, among miscellaneous survey materials catalogued as having no research value, there is a negative sleeve. The sleeve is glassine, standard issue for federal survey use in the early 1900s. It is signed in pencil on the lower right corner, T.E. Beckwith, September 1902, Wyoming Interior Survey, in the careful, deliberate hand of a man who knew how to keep a record. The sleeve is approximately 4 inches by 5 inches. It was designed to hold a single glass plate negative. The plate it was designed to hold has been transferred to a federal repository that has no record of receiving it. The sleeve has been sitting empty for over 100 years, catalogued under a heading that was chosen specifically to ensure that no one would look twice. Someone chose that heading. Someone made the decision that this particular piece of survey ephemera had no research value. That decision was made before anyone opened the box, before anyone read the sleeve, before anyone understood what the empty space inside it